Hello and welcome to Education Now. I'm Meira Levinson. I'm the Juliana W. and William Foss Thompson Professor of Education and Society and Director of the EdEthics Initiative here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Today, as you know, we're going to discuss the important role that educators can play in helping students engage with others who have different points of views and perspectives from their own, and how we teach students to listen and talk across differences. These can be challenging conversations for many of us to have. You know, we want to teach students, but of course, there are many ways in which we need to teach ourselves and teach other adults. But I'm really excited because we have an outstanding panel to guide us. So we also want to hear from you and our virtual audience. I'm going to be discussing, sort of leading the conversation with our guests, whom I'll introduce in just a second, for about the first 20 minutes, and then we're going to have the last 10 minutes for questions from you. So please feel free to submit your questions anytime for our panelists by using the question and answer button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Also, you'll find closed caption access there if that would be helpful. So let's get started by welcoming our guests. We have three really wonderful guests, starting with Carlton Green. Carlton is Assistant Clinical Professor and Co-Director with his colleague Jasmine Pichardo of the Intergroup Dialogue Training Center. It's based at the University of Maryland College of Education. Welcome, Carlton. Next, we have education consultant and coach Kara Pranikoff. Kara supports educators in deepening their practice of inquiry-based teaching of social studies and writing, and she co-hosts the asynchronous teacher coaching platform EduBoost. Welcome, Kara. And then last but not least is my colleague here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, Richard Weissbourd. Rick is Senior Lecturer in Education and Director of the Making Caring Common project. And welcome to the panel, Rick. All right.
Thank you.
Terrific. As I said, we're going to start with a conversation and then welcome the voices of and the questions from our audience members in. Really, I want us to start with sort of the most basic question, which is, why do schools matter when it comes to this work, right? Like, you know, teaching kids how to listen to and talk with people who have different perspectives, that's something that I think as parents, we do kind of from the moment they're born. It's something that kids can learn through media, in playing with friends, from religious organizations, you know, their basketball teams. What role do schools play, and why do schools matter when it comes to this work? Why don't we start with you, Rick, and then we can move to Kara and finish up with you, Carlton.
Yeah. So I do think schools have a critical role to play in this, and partly because we have universal education in this country, and it's one place where people with diverse perspectives are often together. And you know, the other settings that you mentioned in homes, there often are not diverse perspectives, or at least they're contained, they're bounded in ways that schools are often not bounded. That's not to say that schools aren't politically segregated too, because they often are. And I think sometimes we need to have students talking across schools. But in general, schools are a place where diverse kids are, where there's an expectation around conversation, where there can be opportunities to develop kids' skills in having conversations like this. And I think these are difficult conversations, where there can be a commitment of adults to this work, where adults can confer with each other too about this very challenging and difficult work. So for all those reasons and others, I think schools can be a place that are laboratories of democracy in a way that a lot of other settings can't in the same way.
Thanks, Rick. What would you say, Kara?
Well, so first of all, it's so nice to be in space talking with all of you about this really important topic. And Rick, I just want to piggyback on that idea of schools as laboratories of democracy. And I think as teachers, we come to school kind of for the biggest reason of nurturing, caring, and compassionate humans, right? And that's a life's work. And we have an abundance of time with our students. We have 180 plus days. And of course, we're learning in community, and part of any thriving community is a diversity of experiences and perspectives. And so when you really pull back, we have this incredible opportunity to skill build every day. When we're in space together, academically and socially for such a long period of time, things are going to arise. That is part of being in a community. And so we have this opportunity as educators to take advantage of what arises, to take advantage of the differences of perspectives, and see them as learning opportunities and times to skill build, both for ourselves, how do we facilitate those conversations, and for our students, how can we keep our eyes on helping them develop a notion of how to live and learn together. So schools are a place for that.
Thanks, Carl. Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Rick.
I just want to say something really quickly, and I know you want to go on, but I think part of the problem in the country right now is that we are living in different media ecosystems. We don't have a shared reality. It's hard to have a shared morality when you don't have a shared reality.
Yeah.
Schools are also places that should be about how do you discern the truth? I mean, they should be about critical inquiry as well.
So that actually picks up on a follow-up I was going to ask you, Cara, before we turn to you, Carlton, because you said that schools are places for nurturing, caring, and compassionate humans. And I was thinking about the current contestation over schools whose purpose might be that, as compared to schools who many people think of their purpose is to promote academic learning. And so when we're talking about schools as spaces to promote, as laboratories of democracy and to promote conversation across lines of difference, is this sort of about the social emotional part, and how do you relate this to the academic learning goals that I think many people want to center in education in the schools?
Yeah, I think that's such a wise question to ask. We have this tendency, right, to silo that social emotional learning is one thing, academic learning is another thing. But what we know about all learners is that none of us can learn anything if we don't have a sense of belonging and safety and security and a sense of self within the community where we're learning. We can admit that learning anything takes risks, it takes vulnerability, we need to be able to persevere. All of those things require a safety within that community, that sense of belonging. And so we cannot separate our social emotional selves and our academic selves. It's just not possible, even if people purport that it is. It's not part of being a human. So they go hand in hand.
Great, thanks, Carl. That's really helpful. And so, Carlton, I'll invite you to respond to why do schools matter when it comes to this work. And already we've actually started teeing up also the next question. Why is this work so hard? Rick has brought up these separate, media ecosystems, the challenges of a shared morality, shared truth. Cara has brought up the question of social emotional safety and belonging and inclusion as a component of learning. So I'm going to invite you to respond to both questions. Why do schools matter? And then also, why is this work so hard?
Yeah, I would just, in listening to Rick and Cara, a part of the summary of why I think schools matter is because I think schools are socializing agents for us. And we learn some of the ethic around how to be in community with other people, especially people who are different from us. That is one of the tasks, right? That even whether or not it is explicit or just implicit, it's a part of what happens in school settings. And I think that a part of what Carol was also putting on the table, I think that there are ways that in order to be able to have conversations with people who are different from us, we also have to develop an ethic or some values or virtues around care and courage, right? And as Rick was talking about, so like this schools being places of democracy, we need care and courage in order to be in relationship with each other. And for me, when I think about why does that become difficult, right? Or why can schools be difficult places? That I think that the history of education or some of the ways that we teach in classrooms actually sets us up to sometimes be in competition with each other rather than to be in community with each other, right? These spaces can be very hierarchical. We tend to value or reward people who are excelling better than others, right? We set them up to be competitive spaces. And that actually contributes to what I think becomes the bigger issue, especially when we're trying to have conversations that are difficult, is that we don't necessarily socialize each other, or we don't socialize students because sometimes we don't have the socialization to navigate conflict very well, right? These conversations really can be experienced as conflictual, and we all have conflict as a part of our lives, but we all have different conflict stories, right? And conflict can oftentimes be perceived as a threat in the environment, and that threat triggers our fight, flight, or freeze response, which is deeply connected to our emotional responses. And I would say we don't teach about how to navigate emotions in school settings, right, effectively. And if we don't have a type of emotional intelligence in school settings, then we're not going to be able to have these conversations. We're not going to be able to have our students have these conversations. And we, as educators, won't be participating them in very effective ways. So those are some of my initial thoughts about why it's hard. Certainly others. What do you think about why it's hard?
I'm not going to respond to that. I'm going to invite Rick into the conversation, and then we'll turn to Cara.
Well, Meira, we're all going to try and pull you out here, so I hope you'll be up for it at some point. And I don't want to pile on to. I'm going to pile on a little bit to why this is hard, but then I think we all want to get us out of that and talk about why this work is so important. And there are people who are doing the work and doing it very well. So, but in addition to the thing, and I agree with what has been said. In addition to what has been said, I do think there are fundamental conflicts here. One is that people have a right to freedom of speech, and people also have a right to freedom from discrimination. And so, if you're in a classroom and you want to elicit religious views, but those religious views are homophobic and they're LGBTQIA students in your class, that's a very tough thing to navigate. If you want to elicit views about immigrants and you have students who have anti-immigrant views, and you also have immigrant students in your class, that's a very tough thing to navigate. I think there are ways to think about those things, but I do this with grad students at the ed school. It's difficult for all of us to navigate some of these questions. I also think from a teacher perspective, there's so many landmines. There are things that you can say that's going to trigger a parent, and do you want to be consumed with dealing with an angry parent? Do you have support from your administration? And without support from your administration, these conversations become very difficult. In a lot of schools, there just isn't enough practice too. I mean, these conversations need scaffolding, and this is related to what Carlton was saying, I think. Kids need to learn to listen. Kids need to learn to empathize. Kids need to learn to have conversations when the stakes aren't high, disagreements when the stakes aren't high. And so without the scaffolding, these conversations are particularly difficult. But I think you can do the scaffolding. But anyway, let me stop there.
All right, great. So we are going to turn to what can be done. So Cara, let me invite you into the conversation, see if there's anything you want to add about why this work is so hard. And then I know that you do amazing work in schools and with educators. So I'm going to invite you to start us off on what can be done. And then we'll turn to the two of you, Rick and Carlton. And then we're going to invite in the audience questions, which I see are coming in, but I'll continue to invite you to put them in. Cara.
Great. Thanks, Meira. So I want to just underscore something that both Carlton and Rick, you brought up. There is this fact that many of us did not have perhaps a family or a school setting in which conflicts were discussed, in which we had our own skills. And so as teachers and as adults, we're both developing our skills and trying to teach those skills at the same time. And that can be really challenging. I also just want to acknowledge that there can be a apprehension or a discomfort when we're heading into a moment in our classroom where we have very different opinions or a comment that might have caused harm. And our natural reaction is to shut it down or to move away. And we have to almost train ourselves to keep the conversation open, to respond the best we can in the moment, to come back again the next day if there's a follow-up. We have to understand that there's not one move that any of us is going to make that's going to make it better, that's going to develop all of those skills. It's lots and lots of conversations, just kind of an understanding and a belief that I want to be in this work. It's important in my community. So I'm going to keep going even when it's hard. And I think that mindset makes it difficult, but also makes it exciting and empowering. So what is it that we can do, right? The first is the understanding and the belief and the grounding that this is part of my work as an educator, that I'm raising, caring and compassionate humans, as I said before, and that part of that is understanding and embracing the conflict and differences of opinions. If you're a teacher and you're worried about what a parent might say, you can get some language that's not yours. You can look to language like the social justice standards from Learning for Justice, which names specifically that, students can feel good about their own identities and honor and not be mean about anybody else's different identities or perspectives or whatever it is. So we can get language that's not ours. I think in the classroom, we can do all sorts of things proactively. We can be actively developing community on a regular basis. We can have a regular kind of strand of independent student talk where kids are talking to each other, sharing ideas, developing the notion that when I'm sharing or talking in the classroom, it's not just about sharing my idea, but also it's about growing ideas together, whatever they may be. We can have agreements with our classroom about how it is that we're going to talk and listen to each other and respond when something feels hard. We can determine the way we want to engage. We can also just understand that emotions are part of being human. Pleasant emotions and unpleasant emotions, they're not good or bad, that sometimes we all have big emotions, and we can develop proactively, like, what are the choices that I have as a student when I have a big emotion because of something that I've read, because of some current event, because of something that's happening in my family? Am I going to take some deep breaths? Am I going to take a walk? We can do all of these things kind of proactively and be clear in our community. Conflicts are going to come up, and we're going to understand how to navigate them together. That way, when we're reactive, when there is a moment, we can go back to the agreements and say, this is how we said we were going to engage with each other. Let's check ourselves. Are we engaging in ways where we're trying to listen for understanding and hold, different perspectives? Ideally, if a student has a big feeling or sees somebody else have a big feeling in your classroom, they encourage each other. They support each other in processing them. So I think it's about being proactive and reactive and really clear with our students that this is part of our work, that we're going to make mistakes, that we're going to continue to work and skill build together. And this is a space where we can do this. There's not any shame in making mistakes. We're gonna learn how to engage together across differences.
Thank you, Cara. Rick, I know that you do a lot of this kind of coaching and work with schools in the Caring Common network. Can you tell us about some of that work that you do that also offers some paths for change and action? And then Carlton, I would love to hear about some of the work that you do at the higher ed level around this.
Yeah, let me reinforce some things that Cara said. I mean, I think the norm setting she's talking about is just critical for this work. Sorry, I have one of those automatic lights. Yes, we are trying to give teachers tools, resources for having these conversations. I was going to say that Facing History also has these resources and tools. Meira, your program may have resources and tools. The Ethics in Education program, Teaching Tolerance, has tools. So there are tools that are available for folks. And, they're taking people through a series of steps that start with empathic listening, that include lower stakes conversations about things like vegetarianism, that also include conversations about human rights. And one of the things I want to say is that I don't think we want to have these conversations just to have these conversations. And I think it's important to be able to mend fractures and for people to get along. But we want to have these conversations also because we really believe in principles of human rights and justice and inclusion and fairness, and we want to advance those principles. So part of the work too is how do you have conversations in ways that advance those principles? So I wanted to highlight that as well. And We've also done some work with teachers about how to respond to parents and with administrators about how to respond to parents, because that's such a critical part of this work as well.
Can you give one like 30-second example of how teachers or administrators should respond to parents who are concerned?
I think one thing, a couple things to keep in mind about this is that parents shouldn't be blindsided. I think parents need to know that these conversations are happening. And that where things get really hard is if parents feel blindsided. I also think that sometimes the loudest voices are driving these school decisions. And you may have a fairly small number of parents who don't want to talk about race or immigration, for example, but they're dominating. And doing some brief surveys with parents early on too can help, because in my experience, there are a lot of school communities where, in fact, most parents do think, especially now, it's important to have these conversations.
Thanks, Rick. Carlton.
Sure. So here at the Intergroup Dialogue Training Center, we are, launching some initiatives and beginning some of our conversations with faculty. We're talking to them about some things that I think that Kara and Rick have mentioned, right? How do you set intentions when you're going into the classroom and you know that today might be a day where something difficult could come up, right? What becomes your intentions? That actually helps you to stay grounded. It helps you to keep your prefrontal cortex online, right? Such that you can be really focused in the conversation or just don't get so triggered in the conversation. It can be really important to set intentions around that. We talk a lot about setting these norms, as Kara has mentioned. I'm constantly talking to folks about how it is that we have to recognize that emotions are information and empathy is a skill. Just because we are humans, we are teachers, we're educators, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have good empathic skills for being able to respond not only to our students, but to ourselves. So we have to really work at developing the muscle of empathy on a continuous basis. Because if we don't, right, just like any other muscle, it's going to atrophy and it doesn't get any stronger. I think that the other thing that I would highlight that I think that Kara was saying that across my time in doing work in higher education is I think that it becomes really important for us to learn how to practice vulnerability and to learn how to apologize and repair relationships, right? If we are not demonstrating in the context of the classroom how to actually listen with vulnerability, how to express ourselves with some vulnerability around the things that maybe we don't understand or haven't quite figured out, if in fact we don't learn how to apologize and repair the relationships that we have with people when something wrong does occur or something harmful occurs in the classroom, right? It tells the students that it's not safe to do that either. So we really have to model, even at this level, or especially at this level in higher education, how do you do some really good repair work around some of these conversations? Because it sets everybody else up to know that repair is possible and we can learn from that.
Thank you.
Really super quickly.
Yes, super quickly.
I will be super quick. One is Making Caring Common also has a resource on navigating social issues in the classroom that I didn't want to forget. But the other is,
yes, it's gone into the chat already.
oh, good. I want to pick up on Carlton's point, because I think the work is about cultivating care, but it's also about cultivating forgiveness and grace and generosity and humility. And that should be the work of schools as well. So anyway, I will stop there.
Okay, so that's what I want to jump on, because we are getting a bunch of questions from our audience related to schools' roles and readiness to do the kind of social emotional learning that all three of you are talking about. So some of our audience members have brought up that teachers have been told that they're not allowed to teach or address social emotional skills. And so does that mean that they also have to stay away from these kinds of efforts to teach kids to talk across difference, given how much emotional regulation and emotional intelligence and emotional awareness and so forth you have talked about? There have also been questions coming in from the audience saying, like asking, how can you imagine responding to families who believe that schools are no place for social emotional learning, let alone social emotional learning is inherently connected to academics? And there are concerns also about the demands that this places on teachers who may have been taught to teach math or history or arts or health or whatever, but not necessarily taught, say, about prefrontal cortex regulation or about, say, grace. And what does this mean that we are setting up teachers with the expectation to do this work well? Who wants to take those set of concerns on?
So I'm happy to jump in.
Great.
I think all of those questions are wise and relevant and are reality right now. I think, first of all, this work is hard to do on your own. So I think it's really great to find some compatriot. Maybe it's somebody in your school, maybe it's somebody not in your school, but someone who is going to be the person who you trust and who you skill build with, and you're honest about the challenge and the struggle. I think that that is important. I also think that many of the things that we're talking about happen in the midst of the day. So we can talk about social emotional learning, and we can talk about when a child comes back from recess and has been hurt, you can hold that kid's hands and ask that kid to take 3 deep breaths with you. Is that social emotional learning? It is social emotional learning. However, nobody's going to walk into your classroom and say, don't breathe with your child, right? So I think that we need to think about what are the in the minute things that we can do all of the time in conversation. There are ways that we build community just by how we welcome kids into our classroom, allow them to speak and share about what's on their mind. So I think that we can embrace every moment that we have and give examples and articulate to our children, like through our examples, that they matter, that all of perspectives are okay. I think it comes in our discretionary moments.
Thanks, Cara. Carlton, then Rick.
Yeah, I think this is a really hard question, to be honest with you. Right, given the socio-political context that we find ourselves in, or the socio-political context that we have created for ourselves. I think that there is something to be said here from my perspective that I think as a psychologist, what I've learned is that education is about people and it's not just about ideas. So if I were if when working with the pre-service teachers here as well as faculty, I'm constantly trying to get them to make sure that we are centering people and not just ideas, right? And to be communicating that to parents, that this is a part of what it is that we are doing here. And we are preparing young people to go out and to live in communities where they can be leaders as well as people who are responsive to the needs of the people in those communities. And if we are not necessarily doing that work here in this big socializing agent, right? I come back to that. Then we are not necessarily doing the work of education. I'll also say to parents, I think you want me to help your child be a good human, right? And that's a part of what it is that I'm doing here. And if you have questions about me helping your child to be a good human in the context of these other little humans, I'm open to that. But that's what I'm committed to doing. Right. I think that there got to be some real explicit and maybe even to Kara's point, right? How do you join with other teachers to be able to say that's what we're going to be doing? We are educating good humans here.
Thank you. And Rick, can I put you on the spot with a variation on that, which is the other theme I'm seeing in these questions, which is what about when there's disagreement about what it means to teach people to be good humans? How do we do this work in a time of polarization and contest and sort of political contestation?
You know, in our research, there's a lot of disagreement about moral beliefs, you know, about whether you are pro-life or pro-choice. There is not a lot of disagreement about certain moral capacities. I mean, there's wide agreement that caring is important, that being honest is important, that fairness is important. There's scare words out there. The word justice has become a scare word for a lot of people. And the language we use is very important. I would never use the word morality. We don't use it in our work because it sends people in a lot of directions. But I actually think there's a lot of consensus that we want kids who are respectful, who are caring, who are aware of others. I feel that way about SEL, tremendous amount of misinformation about SEL too. And that if you ask parents, do you want kids to be able to manage their own anger? A large majority are going to say yes. I mean, Cara gave another example. Do you want kids to be able to calm themselves down when they're really dialed up? Large majority of people are going to say yes. So part of this is in the messaging and the packaging, I think, too.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much to all three of our guests, Carlton Green, Kara Pranikoff, and Rick Weissbourd. And we really appreciate all of you in the audience for joining us today for our last episode of the season. And please look out for more Education Now sessions next semester.